So yesterday was, you may have seen, heard, been reminded of, that it was International Women's Day. Mike was telling us, Darlene and me, on that for his mom in Burundi. International Women's Day is a big day, that she gets a new dress. She gets up early in the morning and leaves for the whole day, and leaves the kids with her Mike's dad, and she just goes out and enjoys the day and gets back like late at night, and just it is her day, and so I found that fascinating. I don't know, it's kind of a day on the calendar. Sometimes you see some references to it. Some politicians may say something about it, but I don't know. I know some of our women went to, some of our ladies went to a workshop at Kelstern on studying the Bible. That's what they did for International Women's Day. But anyways, around the world, the idea is that we take a moment to applaud women and girls in various ways, to just celebrate them. And the goals of International Women's Day, to applaud, to elevate women, are good and right. And in the pages of the Bible, we find that there is a rock-solid foundation for us as people of God to uphold women. We know better than anyone else that women and girls have been created by God in His image, and therefore every woman has immeasurable value. I need to switch my stuff around here. I'm a lefty in more ways than one. Beyond the creation narrative, we also know that women were prized and treasured by Jesus throughout the Gospels. Many, many women followed Jesus through his earthly ministry and after his earthly ministry, and they can be counted among his disciples. Think of names like Jesus' mother, Mary and Martha, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna, Salome, and there are other names that you come to your mind. Did you know, though, that there is only one woman in the New Testament who is openly called a disciple of Jesus? Only one woman. All those names I mentioned, I did not mention the name of the woman, and the only one who is called a disciple. If you have your Bibles this morning, I encourage you to turn to the 9th chapter of the book of Acts, Acts chapter 9, because I want to talk about this woman. Her name, Tabitha. You may be more familiar with her Greek name, depending on the emphasis of your Sunday school teacher. If you remember from Sunday school, her name was Dorcas. Tabitha was a Jewish woman living in the city of Joppa, a port city, actually the city that Jonah took off from when he tried to escape from God. It's near Tel Aviv in modern-day Israel. And Tabitha is the only woman, and you see it right there in the opening sentence, the only woman in the New Testament who is called a disciple. And it's actually, if you know, we don't have this in English, but those of you who know French or other languages, you know, lots of languages have masculine and feminine forms of nouns. And this is the word disciple here is actually the feminine form of the Greek word for disciple. And it only occurs here. This is the only time the feminine form of the word disciple occurs in the New Testament. It's in Luke's account of Tabitha here in the book of Acts. So it's interesting that Luke does this. It's the only woman that we see called a disciple. And it suggests to me that Tabitha was not only a committed follower of Jesus, but also that she was a very important part of the Christian community in Joppa. Anytime you get somebody in Scripture, we get a name, you know that that person was probably well known. Just like, well, we mentioned names this morning, Max Lucado, Lynn Anderson. Many of you, oh yeah, Lynn Anderson, we all know, you knew who was being referred to. Well, think of the early Christians listening to, reading, hearing Luke's account in the book of Acts, and he mentions in Joppa there was a disciple named Tabitha. We know Tabitha. We know her. And Luke provides several details surrounding Tabitha's story. But he starts with these glowing words. In Joppa, there was a disciple named Tabitha. In Greek, her name is Dorcas, probably given because maybe in Joppa there was a real mixture of Christians who were both of the Jewish heritage and Greek heritage. And she was always doing good and helping the poor. Glowing words about this woman, identified as a disciple, described as a generous supporter of the poor. This morning, I want to delve a little deeper into this account. This may be an account that some of you are familiar with from Sunday school, but there is so much more, and this is included in the book of Acts. I think it's not just a passing story. We may have passed over it, but let's take a little bit more time. Like many women in the New Testament, Tabitha here is not mentioned in relation to a man. We don't know anything about Tabitha's husband. We don't even know if Tabitha had a husband. And a lot of women in the New Testament, we don't learn anything about their husbands. Tabitha isn't described by her family situation. And that was, in Tabitha's day, a little bit unusual. It was a patriarchal society, and women were often identified by their connection to the male head of the household. But what we learn about Tabitha is nothing about her family situation. That's not important. What we learn about is her ministry. Tabitha seems to have been independent of either a husband or even a father, because in Greco-Roman society, the father in the household retained a lot of power over all of the household. And what she does here, her acts of helping, of doing good, they're all her own. They're what she does. She was always doing good. She was helping the poor. I suspect that Tabitha was a relatively wealthy woman, to always doing good and helping the poor. I don't know for sure, but Tabitha was likely a widow who was wealthy. She might have been, even more so, a relatively young widow, because there was a high mortality rate in New Testament times. And husbands were usually considerably older than their wives. And it was not unusual then for wives to outlive their husbands. Think about the case of Joseph and Mary. We hear a lot about Mary in the New Testament, but Joseph very quickly disappears from the scene. We don't hear anything about Joseph as the father of Jesus. Really, do we? Probably because Joseph was much older than Mary, and Joseph died and Mary was a widow. But I think the same situation here with Tabitha. But Tabitha's life was also cut short. An illness happens. It seems to have been sudden, seems to have been brief, and she dies. About that time, she became sick and died, and her body was washed and placed in an upstairs room. Lydda was near Joppa, so when the disciples heard that Peter was in Lydda, they sent 2 men to him and urged him, "Please come at once." It's an interesting detail here that Luke includes. Tabitha's body is washed and then laid in an upper room. Have you ever wondered why we get that information? It wasn't unusual. It was actually the normal practice to wash a body. But laying the body in a room, that was not the usual practice. Usually, Jewish people buried their dead very soon after death, typically on the same day. And for very observant Orthodox Jews, that is the same today. But Lydia is placed in an upstairs room. Why is Luke mentioning this? It could be that he's drawing our minds to some Old Testament passages. Now, we're not as good of students of the Old Testament as some of the first Christians were, especially those Christians that came from Jewish heritage. And so we don't maybe pick up on these. I don't know if you have one of those study Bibles. If you look at verses 37 and 38, if you have any footnotes in your study Bible that has a cross-reference, I don't have anything in mine. So not even my footnotes in my Bible. Maybe if you have a really good study Bible, it picks up on it. But there's an echo here in verse 37, where it talks about Lydia being placed in an upstairs room. And it takes us back to the stories of Elijah and Elisha, when they restored the life of 2 sons who were sons of prominent women. In the case of Elijah, Elijah carries the dead son of the widow of Zarephath to an upper room and lays him on a bed. 1 Kings 17:19 on your screen. In the case of Elisha, the Shunammite woman carries the body of her dead son upstairs and lays him on Elisha's bed. So I wonder if Luke is, by mentioning that Tabitha's body is laid out in the upper room, like those of the 2 sons were laid out in an upper room, is he trying to get us to make a connection between the 2 accounts? Both Elijah and Elisha, if you look at these stories, what happens next? They pray to God in the upper rooms, and the sons are restored to life. It seems, maybe, were the Christians in Joppa, by placing Tabitha's body in an upstairs room, were they somehow suggesting their hope that somehow Tabitha would be restored to life? They had heard that Peter was in Lydda, about 23 kilometers away, and they had heard that through Peter's ministry, if you go back a little bit in chapter 9, you'll read about how there was a paralyzed man who had just been healed by Peter. And so maybe the church is hopeful. And so they send these 2 men to urge Peter to come to Joppa. Tabitha clearly was a valued and vital member of that church family. Her death was regarded as a tragedy. And so Peter is persuaded to come to Joppa from Lydia, a journey that would take at least a day. And so considering the two men went there to get Peter and came back, for them it was at least a two-day journey. And Peter comes with them. And when he arrives, he's taken upstairs to the room. And all the widows stood around Peter, crying and showing him the robes and the other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was still with them. By the time Peter arrives, Tabitha may have been dead for a few days, and he's taken to the upper room where the body's laid out. An upper room was usually the largest, the best appointed room in a large first century house. And though Luke never states who this room belongs to, I suspect it's part of Tabitha's house. Luke mentions two other upper rooms in the book of Acts, right? And both of those upper rooms that are mentioned in the book of Acts, talks about it in the first chapter and then in the 20th chapter. When he talks about the upper rooms, they are talked about as meeting places for Christians. They gathered in the upper room. And Luke also in Acts 12 talks about how the church in Jerusalem often would meet at Mary of Jerusalem's home. Remember when Peter and John are imprisoned and then they're released, they know exactly where to go to. They go to Mary's home because they know the Christians have gathered there for prayer and worship. So Mary probably had a larger home that could accommodate a small group of people. And the church at Philippi, again in Acts chapter 16, met in the house of Lydia, who was a dealer of purple. So I don't think it's a stretch to say that the church at Joppa probably met in the upper room in Tabitha's house. She was the host for the church gathering. Anyways, in this room, we get this stirring scene of all the widows who were weeping, showing Peter the clothes that Tabitha, Dorcas, had made. I don't know if they're showing Peter the clothes that they're currently wearing, that she's made, or the clothes that have been put on display in honor of Tabitha. Whatever the case, this is a very emotional scene here. And Tabitha, who's called Dorcas in this verse, is probably more than a weaver. She's probably more than a seamstress who worked by herself, just creating one garment at a time. She may have had a small workforce going. She may have worked with others. Maybe she financed and organized others to make garments. And she was likely involved in clothing the poor, including widows. Notice the widows showing Peter, the robes and the other clothing. We know from the very first verse, she was known for her good works, her kind acts, the kind of deeds that were valued and practiced by Jews and Christians. When Paul writes to Timothy, he talks about widows who were, and there seemed to be a ministry of widows in the early church. And Paul talks about women who were eligible to be enrolled as widows in the church at Ephesus. And he gives a list of their qualities. And a widow who was eligible to be enrolled would be well known for her good deeds, such as bringing up children, showing hospitality, washing the feet of the Lord's people, helping those in trouble, and devoting herself to all kinds of good deeds. I think Tabitha would meet a number of those qualities. We know she cared for widows who were poorer than her, who may have been afflicted. And although the text doesn't clearly say it, I suspect that having that home with an upper room may have been that meeting place for Christians in Joppa. She exercised hospitality. It may have even served as a home for widows who were impoverished. And certainly in the first century, when you lost the male member of whether your husband or your son, as a woman, you were very much at risk of poverty in the first century. Does anyone know what the names Tabitha and Dorcas mean? Gazelle. Gazelle. That's Bible trivia for you. The focus of this story really comes in verse 40. Peter sends everybody out of the room. Then he gets down on his knees and he prays. And turning toward the dead woman, he says, "Tabitha, get up." And she opens her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. Peter sends them all out of the room, just like Jesus did when he healed. Just like Elijah and Elisha did in those accounts I referenced earlier. Sends everybody out of the room, and then he prays for a miracle. And he turns to the body and he speaks to it. And Peter probably spoke Aramaic words. He probably said something like this, and I mean, this is given to me. I'm not coining this phrase. He probably said something like, "Tabitha, cum." Tabitha, cum. Interestingly, just one letter different from what Jesus said to the daughter of Jairus when he raised her from the dead. If you go to Mark chapter 5, verse 41, Mark tells us that Jesus said in Aramaic to the daughter of Jairus, "Talitha cum." Peter, "Tabitha cum." Jesus, "Talitha cum." And Tabitha responds, opens her eyes. What a description. Her life has been restored. And when she opens her eyes, she sees Peter and then sits up. This is where you say, I wish there was a little more detail here, right? I mean, what is going through Tabitha's mind when she becomes conscious? Does she know that the man in the room is Peter? Had they met previously somehow? Does Tabitha realize that she's been dead and brought back to life? This is where the novelists and the screenwriters can have fun, right? They can go into this and speculate but we just don't. But all we know is that Peter takes her by the hand and helps her to her feet. And then he calls for the believers, especially the widows. See, I think there's a real special connection between Tabitha and the widows here, and presents her to them alive. And then what happens? We don't know. We don't know anything about how the people reacted when they saw their beloved Tabitha alive. That's all left to our imagination. Shock? Awe? Here's what we get. This is how the story ends. This became known all over Joppa, I bet, and many people believed in the Lord. Very typical of Luke to comment in his stories about people becoming believers, about the gospel spreading, about the church growing. You see, that's because Tabitha's story is not really about Tabitha. It's not really about Dorcas. It's more about the church. It's more about the community of Jesus' followers. It's more about people believing in the Lord. Fascinating little episode, just a few verses, but so much to think about. You know, and it's important to understand that when Luke comes to sit down and write the book of Acts, part 2, by the way, Luke is a 2-volume writer in the New Testament. The Gospel of Luke is his first volume. Acts is volume 2. And he's writing both of these volumes, so to speak, to a man named Theophilus, lover of God, whether Theophilus was his real name or Theophilus is a description of him. And he's writing to Theophilus about all that Jesus began to do. And so, unfortunately, in our Bibles, somehow Luke and Acts have gone separated, but this is, you can read Luke and continue straight on into the book of Acts. And so Luke, when he writes his gospel, he tells Theophilus that I'm not telling you everything that happened. I've carefully chosen what I want to share with you. I've done some editing, okay, and that's not bad. And so understand that when Luke sits down to write his gospel and to write volume 2, he's carefully choosing what he's going to include. And he's carefully chosen which characters he's including in the Acts of the Apostles, the account that he's writing for his patron, Theophilus. And he chooses to include this account of Tabitha. Don't forget that. This has been chosen to be included in this account. This story about a wealthier woman who was prominent in her community. Maybe Luke throws her story in, so to speak, because that's someone that Theophilus could identify with. But more than that, maybe Tabitha is a good representative of a first century woman who was an outstanding disciple of Jesus. Tabitha is not praised here for the typical womanly virtues of her time. There's no comment about how Tabitha ran a good household, how Tabitha was quiet, she was graceful, she was a delicate woman. Her good works are not directed towards her husband, they're not directed towards her children. Her good works are all for the larger community, her real family. And Tabitha is a reminder to us that women have always played a crucial role in serving and growing the church. And some scholars see in this passage a forerunner of, I mentioned when we're looking at 1 Timothy 5, that there seems to have been some order of widows in the church. And Paul makes reference in 1 Timothy 5 to widows being enrolled. We're not exactly sure what all that is involved, but maybe this incident, maybe this woman, Dorcas, was the seed that was planted for what became later this enrolling, this order of widows, this system that the early church had of caring for vulnerable women. And I've mentioned why already women who were widows would have been so at risk in that time. In her book entitled Abilita Faith, Kat Armas says this about Tabitha: a woman disciple who is often overlooked in our conversations, was of utmost importance in the story of the early church, so much so that her life was worthy of resurrection. In his commentary on Acts, Willie James Jennings says, "This woman matters, and the work she does for widows matters to God. It matters so much that God will not allow death the last word. Tabitha is an activist who lives again, in resurrection power." Tabitha lived like the kingdom of God had actually arrived. She lived like Jesus had actually risen from the dead. And that all of that put demands on her life, put demands on her time, her resources, her relationships, her sense of belonging, her community, and her loyalty. Tabitha had become part of a new family. Maybe if she was a widow, she was now part of a new family, the family of God. And she had now new family members to care for, and her time and her resources were devoted to them. She was someone who served like the kingdom of God had arrived. She was an exemplary disciple who challenges and inspires us all, women and men. And so this morning I would encourage you, in line with what Jen has talked about, to give a word of encouragement to some of our women this morning. If you have been encouraged by some of our women, by a particular woman, let her know that. And for all of us, men and women, think of the legacy. What is the legacy that we are leaving behind? If there were to be a book written about the church in Gravelburg, would my name pop up? Would there be something said about what Darrell did for his church, family, and community? What's the legacy that I'm leaving? That, like Tabitha, my story will be told more than 2,000 years later in a gathering church in Gravelburg, Saskatchewan.